It really is a great honor to be here this evening, and I just ran into Bobby and Herb Gstalder in the elevator the first time I met them, so nobody knew who anybody was, but now we do. And I want to thank them very much for this great honor, and also many thanks to anyone else who was responsible for bringing me here this evening. You know, I've been trying to get out of the field of journalism. I've retired from the Times, but I've got another book that I've got to get out. I've got a June deadline to get the manuscript in, and there's a documentary, I guess, that I'll be working on. But what I really want to do is write a play. And, you know, being in this beautiful theater, I could put a play on right here. But tonight, we'll talk about other matters. If it gets to a point where you can't hear me, let me know. I'll adjust the microphone. But and also I have a little bit of a scratchy throat, so from time to time, you'll pardon me if I take a sip. When I was at the Daily News many moons ago, they would take a sip, but it wasn't water, the guys. You wouldn't believe what it was like, but on another occasion, I'll tell you stories about the Daily News. You know, I love those stupid criminal stories that you find on the web. One of my favorites is about a guy in South Carolina who became impatient as he was coming to the end of a 4-month prison term. With just 3 hours left before he was to be released, he thought it might be a good idea, seeing the opportunity to escape, to seize that opportunity. So he bolted from a recreation session and fled. That is a quintessential example of bad decision-making. The escapee was soon captured and sent back to jail for another 6 months, 2 months longer than his original sentence. Then there was the ex-convict who robbed a bank and was surprised when the police showed up at his home a short while later to arrest him. How'd you know it was me, he asked. I used the juice. Cops did not know what he was talking about. It turned out that he had rubbed lemon juice on his face because someone had told him that that would make it impossible for the security cameras to record his image. He went into the bank thinking of himself as the invisible man. One more. A guy stole a car. When the victim described the car to the police, she told them that it had a phone in it. So a cop called the number. The thief answered. And the cop said, I saw your ad in the newspaper, and I am interested in buying your car. Sure enough, they made an appointment. The thief showed up with the car and was arrested. These are amusing examples of utter incompetence, and they're funny because the consequences are not too horrendous. Things seem a lot less funny when we watch a great nation like the United States fall into a state of crisis, which is what we're in now, largely because of the neglect and the bad decision-making of its leaders and its ordinary citizens. In many ways, we've acted like those stupid criminals, which is why we found ourselves in a protracted economic crisis with the greatest wealth and economic inequality of any of the advanced nations, with budget deficits as far as the eye can see, with a shrinking middle class, and poverty growing like a cancer for which no one seems to have a cure. In my last column for the New York Times 2 years ago, I wrote that the United States was a country that had lost its way. We can pour shiploads of cash into wars overseas, trillions of dollars, but we can't take care of our obligations to ordinary citizens here at home. Nearly 50 million Americans are poor, an astonishing number when you think about it, 50 million. And that includes more than 16 million children, 1 in every 5 children in the United States. Another 50 million people are what we call the near poor. They're trying to make it just a notch or two above the official poverty line. So we've got 100 million Americans, nearly 1/3 of the entire population, who are poor or can feel the awful flames of poverty licking at their heels. And this is a case at the time when the economic elite in America, that small sliver of the population at the top of the economic pyramid, are enjoying riches that could never previously have been imagined in all of our nation's history. The mayor of my city, New York, is personally worth some $27 billion. But among Michael Bloomberg's constituents, the 8 million residents of New York City, 1 in every 5 is mired in poverty. The homeless family caseload in New York is so great that the shelters have to turn people away. This is wrong, but we don't even hear much about it. The media folks can tell us all about Kim Kardashian and who wore what to the Oscars, but poverty, not so much. Other cities are far worse off than New York. While we've been overseas trying to establish democracy and build up the armies and the economies in places like Baghdad and Kabul, we've been watching cities like Detroit and Camden and Stockton, California, all but collapsing in ruins. Stockton is the largest city ever to declare bankruptcy in the United States. Its police force has been so whittled by layoffs, it can barely function. A middle-aged woman whose home had been burglarized 3 times told the New York Times, "The police don't respond to anything unless there's blood involved." We've all heard of homes being foreclosed, but in Stockton, a bank repossessed city-owned parking garages because Stockton couldn't pay its bills. The bank also seized a $40 million building that was supposed to have been turned into a new city hall. The foreclosure crisis has reached an entirely new level, in my view, when a city starts losing its own buildings. With the crime, the joblessness, the loss of family homes, and many other problems in Stockton, some of the people are freaking out. The director of a battered women's shelter told the Times, "We've never seen anything like the increases in the last 4 to 5 years in calls to our helplines, our emergency shelter, counseling services, and requests for restraining orders." The women coming in are more brutalized than in prior years. People have lost their sense of hope and stability, the director said, and with that comes a lot of anger. The personal suffering that we've seen in the United States over the past 2 or 3 decades, suffering that was intensified by the Great Recession, has been tragic and remarkably widespread. The degree of suffering has been understated in the media. More than 20 million Americans live in extreme poverty. They're trying somehow to survive on less than $11,000 a year for a family of 4. It's hard to imagine how that's even possible. The extreme poor are the folks who will eat 1 meal a day instead of 2 to conserve food. They're the ones who can't even think about getting dental work done. They're the ones, and I've covered this so many times over the years that I've lost count, they're the ones who, when their children die, they can't even afford to bury them. Many of the problems we've long associated with the inner city can now be found in other venues. Spend a little time in some of our down-at-the-heel suburbs or Rust Belt communities and rural towns and villages, and you'll see the poverty and joblessness, the broken families, the out-of-wedlock births, the drug and alcohol abuse, the domestic violence, and on and on. This is what economic deprivation has always done to people. But while the suffering has been widespread, the worst of the pain has been endured by Black Americans. 1 in every 3 Black children is poor. The unemployment rate among African Americans is twice as high as it is among whites. I just saw, coming over here from the train station in the Washington Post, a story about the mayor of Newark, and the unemployment rate in Newark is still almost 14%, 5 years after the beginning of the Great Recession. And remember, the unemployment statistics don't count the working age people who are in prison. Young Black men, as we know, are sent off to prison in wildly disproportionate numbers. If that awful cohort were counted, if you counted all the people, all the Black men who are in prison, if you counted them as unemployed, the Black unemployment rate would be really completely off the charts. One of the most dramatic ways of looking at how poorly blacks are doing is to compare the differences in the wealth of white families and black families, and those differences are staggering. The typical white household, the one right smack in the middle, the median, is worth $113,000. The comparable black household is worth $5,600. If you're a family and your total net worth is just a little over $5,000, you don't really have any money. If your car breaks down, or your roof springs a leak, or God forbid your child gets sick or you lose a job, your family is wiped out. And that's the situation with the typical black family. And that situation is getting worse, it's not getting better. For years now, those black households that had managed to accumulate at least a little wealth have been on a downward trajectory that is steeper than that of just about anyone else who was hurt by the economy. According to the Center for Responsible Lending, fully a quarter of all black homeowners will have lost their homes to foreclosure by the time this housing crisis finally ends. A quarter. There are black neighborhoods, and I've visited many of them, where hardly anyone has a legitimate job. Nobody has a job. These are neighborhoods where all hope seems to have been lost, where the children themselves seem never to have learned to dream. You can interview men at random in these neighborhoods, men in their 20s, men in their 30s, and ask them, what do you do? How do you survive from day to day? And the answer will invariably be the same. They'll tell you, I hustle. It's usually said in a soft voice and sometimes with an embarrassed shrug. What's happening to black individuals and families across America is like a horror movie. Forget about a recession, there's a full-blown depression in black America. As if the damage inflicted by the collapse of the economy and its aftermath was not painful enough, a basic cornerstone of the black middle class since the days of Reconstruction is under ferocious attack right now. And I'm talking about employment in the public sector. The New York Times wrote about a 34-year-old black man named Don Buckley who lost his job as a bus driver for the Chicago Transit Authority. A family man with 2 children, Buckley was unable to find another job and ran through his entire savings of $27,000. That 27 grand was a level of wealth far above the African-American norm. I was the kind of person who put away for a rainy day, he told the Times, and then he added, it's flooding now. The Times pointed out that Buckley was one of tens of thousands of once solidly middle-class African-American government workers, bus drivers in Chicago, police officers and firefighters in Cleveland, nurses and doctors in Florida, who have been laid off since the recession ended in 2009. Such job losses, the Times said, have blunted gains made in employment and wealth during the previous decades and undermined the stability of neighborhoods where there are now fewer blacks who are working and own homes. Black teachers and other African-American public school employees are part of this troubled mix. They're taking a disproportionate hit in the hundreds of thousands of dismissals that are occurring because of budget cuts and because of the unconscionable attacks on the public schools by the mostly fabulously wealthy leaders of the so-called school reform movement. Chicago just announced that it plans to actually close an unprecedented 54 public schools. The overwhelming majority of the students in those schools and much of the personnel are black. What happens in Chicago and elsewhere to the black teachers and principals and administrators who are pushed out, who are fired, whose careers are aborted? And what happens to their families? Nobody seems to care. If there is one thing I've learned in more than 40 years as a journalist, it's that black is not a priority in America. We're facing a terrible crisis here, and not nearly enough attention is being paid. I spoke at a seminar on poverty at Brandeis several months ago, and one of the other speakers cited a statistic that sent a chill through me. The median net worth of single African-American women with children under the age of 18 is $1. Remember, that's the person right in the middle of that population. Now, half of that population, this is what that means, half of that population is worth less than $1, has a negative net worth, less than 0. It's scandalous. We're in denial about just how bad things have gotten. Not too long ago, I sat down with a large group of youngsters from the Bronx. There were about 20 of them, 13 and 14 years old, young kids. I noticed an undercurrent of emotion among the kids that was disturbing, so I asked if they were generally happy with their lives. Only 5 raised their hands. When I asked the others why they were unhappy, they said because their neighborhood was not safe, because one or both of their parents had died, because there was no father in many of their lives, because their families were poor. Several began to cry. One girl said she'd been raped. Another said, I saw someone on my block get shot. After that, I didn't want to go outside. These were children, and their hearts seemed to be breaking as they poured out their stories. They spoke of drug dealers and gang members and people they'd known who had been shot and killed. Several said they never wanted to get married because they saw domestic life as never-ending grief and strife. The adults who were in the room with me were shaken, and so was I. If you don't think we've lost our way, talk to some of these youngsters from the Bronx or Brooklyn or the south side of Chicago or Newark, New Jersey, or South LA or Camden or Detroit. And while the crises I'm talking about are most severe in the black community, it's not just African Americans who are being left behind. A report came out last year showing that the life expectancy for the poorest and least well-educated white Americans had dropped by 4 years just since 1990. Can you imagine? I thought that would be a big national story, but I was wrong. And that's what I mean when I say we're in denial. People run to the shelter of denial when they just can't face the truth, when the truth seems just too awful to contemplate. Now, things were not always like this in the United States. I'm writing a book now called Wounded Colossus, and in it I talk about the early post-World War II decades, the 1950s and 60s, that I grew up in. Having gone through the Great Depression and the war, the United States seemed finally to be getting its act together, becoming, in fact, a more perfect union. By the mid-60s, when I was a teenager, the warm glow of success was spreading like the summer sun to much of the country. The first of the baby boomers had put aside their Davy Crockett hats and Mickey Mouse Club ears and were entering college. Television was moving from black and white to color. Unemployment was low, wages and profits were high, and the nation's wealth, compared to today, was distributed in a much more equitable fashion. Now, the nation was far from perfect, and I would be the last person in the world to suggest otherwise. There was plenty of conflict, small-mindedness, and tremendous bigotry, lots of it of the violent variety. Blacks and women had to mobilize to fend off treatment that was hideously unfair and unjust. Vietnam was an unmitigated disaster. So I'm not trying to portray things as better than they were. But there was also, in those years, an openness to new ideas and a willingness to extend a collective hand to those who were struggling. It was a time in which the Supreme Court struck down one racist statute after another, a time that gave us Medicare and Medicaid, the Peace Corps, and the space program. The middle class, America's proudest creation, was thriving, and it was not yet a mortal sin for someone running for public office to mention the poor. Now, in those heady, sun-washed days, described by the writer Nelson Lichtenstein as the high noon of American capitalism, everything embodied in the great promise of the United States seemed to be coming to fruition. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote in the mid-1960s that steadily increasing affluence seemed an enduring and irreversible reality of American life. The Temptations of Motown, one of my favorite groups, The Temps, who helped power the era's soundtrack, sang of momentary setbacks in love, but felt compelled to add the sociological aside, there's plenty of work, and the bosses are paying. And here I'd like to speak very personally for a moment. I remember those days with great fondness. I thought that life, which was already good, would always get better, not just for me, but for everybody. I believed, in my naive way, that progress was part of the natural order of things, and that inevitably it would continue. I grew up in Montclair, a suburb in New Jersey, about 12 miles outside of New York City. My father and grandfather were both in the upholstery business, and I was close to both of them, very close. I'd be in the back of the shops hanging out with the guys who worked for them, these Damon Runyon-type characters. Learning how to upholster, I'd run to get coffee, I'd listen to the music that was always playing on the radio. Everybody was crazy about Sinatra. On the weekends after these guys got paid, they tried to dress like Sinatra. They'd break the brim down on their hats, you know. I was thrilled just to be around them. And I was car crazy in those days. And I was never happier than when I was driving around with my dad as he made the rounds of customers' homes in various parts of the state. We'd listen to baseball games and sing songs in the car and stop at diners and grab lunch. Excuse me. I thought my dad was the handsomest man in the world, and I thought that my mom was the most beautiful woman. And they were wise. I remember when I was very young, we were fans of the New York Giants. And the Giants had two players named Thompson. One was Bobby Thompson, who hit one of the most famous home runs in all of baseball history. And one was Hank Thompson. Now, Bobby Thompson was white, and Hank was black. So I asked my old man, since they were named Thompson, if they were brothers. No, he said. You know how you can tell they're not brothers? I said, no. He said, Hank Thompson spells his last name with a P in it. And Bobby Thompson doesn't have a P in his last name. If they were brothers, my father said, they'd spell their names the same. I was about 6 years old. My dad didn't see the need to toss the issue of race into that conversation. It was years before I realized what he had done, how he'd helped preserve my innocence for just a little while longer, how he'd let me just be a kid, and I've appreciated it ever since. The reason I bring up the past and my own memories and feelings about it is because I think there are lessons we have forgotten from that era that would have prevented our society from falling into the dismal state that it's in now. If we'd heeded, for example, the lessons of Vietnam, we wouldn't have gotten bogged down for so long in Afghanistan, and we wouldn't have gone into Iraq at all. Another lesson we should have learned but didn't was that striking down laws against segregation was an all-important campaign, but it wasn't enough to win the war against racism, and it certainly wasn't enough to compensate for all that blacks had lost as a result of slavery and the never-ending curse of Jim Crow. Bigotry turned out to have a much longer shelf life than a lot of people ever imagined. The civil rights movement ended too soon, before blacks ever really had a chance to catch up. That point was hammered home to me by James Farmer, who was one of the so-called Big Four leaders of the movement, the others being Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, and Whitney Young Jr. of the National Urban League. And by the way, tonight is the anniversary of the night on which Dr. King was slain in Memphis in 1968. I interviewed James Farmer in 1995, and by then he had become an obscure figure. He was 74 years old and blind, and illness had forced the amputation of his right leg. He lived alone in a house in Fredericksburg, Virginia. But he was in good spirits. He told jokes and laughed uproariously at them. The leg that he lost, he said, with mock chagrin, had been the one that he'd used for kicking butts. Farmer told me that two grave errors had been made, even as the civil rights movement was racking up its stunning successes in the 50s and 60s. The first, he said, was the almost uniform tendency to confuse segregation with racism. That encouraged the mistaken belief that dismantling the apparatus of legal segregation was in some sense the equivalent of decreasing the poisonous levels of racism in the society. The second error in some ways followed from the first. We did not do any long-range planning, he told me, so we were stuck without a program after the success of our efforts. We could have anticipated the backlash that followed. We could have asked ourselves what the job prospects would be for blacks in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and later on. By and large, we didn't do that except for affirmative action. We should have had a plan, he said. Now, this was an issue that President Lyndon Johnson was acutely aware of, and it helps explain why so many black people are still in such tough circumstances today. As Johnson put it, you do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying, now you are free to go where you want, do as you desire, and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a man who for years has been hobbled by chains, liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race saying you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. This, said Johnson, is the next and more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity, not just the legal equity, but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and a result. Well, I'll tell you right now that all the racism from the heyday of the civil rights movement to this very moment in the second decade of the 21st century has hobbled and constrained and continues to hobble and constrain black people in America. Yes, it's still going on. Think of the resegregation of America's public schools. Think of the black homeowners who managed to build a bit of equity over the years only to see their homes and their life savings lost to venomous predatory lenders who targeted black neighborhoods as a hunting ground for easy marks. Think of the profiteers who are raking in untold billions of dollars from public school systems with their testing companies and for-profit education ventures, including profit-making charter schools, all under the cover story of improving the education of poor minority children. They're not interested in doing anything about poverty, mind you. They don't see any profit in that. Think of the prison industrial complex, a scandal of immense proportions. And think of the tremendous continuing effort to prevent black Americans from exercising their fundamental right to vote. People are still trying to keep blacks out of the voting booth nearly a half century after passage of the Voting Rights Act. I won't deny that we've had tremendous successes. Millions of blacks have gone on to college, gotten a first-rate education, established a middle-class standard of living, or better, and raised many, many wonderful children. We've even had a few African Americans soar into the rarefied atmosphere at the highest echelons of government, including a couple of secretaries of state and, of course, the current president. But the landscape overall is gloomy. 1 out of every 3 black children in America is growing up poor. The black middle class is shrinking faster than the polar ice caps in this era of global warming. Nearly half of the children born to middle-class black parents in the late 1960s were living in poverty or near poverty in the early years of this century. In other words, we're going backwards. The terrible combination, the situation for black men specifically is horrendous. The terrible combination of economic reversals, parental neglect, racial discrimination, and an absolute orgy of self-destructive behavior have left an extraordinary portion of the black male population in an ever-deepening pit of social and economic degradation. Gangs in many communities have replaced the traditional extended family. Homicide is the leading cause of death for young black men, with the murderous wounds most often inflicted by other young black men. And of course, they're not just killing one another. Most of us have heard the story, to take just one example, of the murder of 15-year-old Hadia Pendleton, who was shot to death in Chicago in January, just a few days after she attended Barack Obama's inauguration. In another terrible case, the daughter of one of my very close friends from high school, one of my best buddies, was murdered by carjackers who dragged her out of her car in Newark, New Jersey, shot her at point-blank range, and then drove off in her car. How is it that we tolerate these atrocities? The violence, the murder, the poverty, the racism, the loss of the lives of so many of our young people, and the loss of hope among so many more. What is the matter with us? I talked about my relationship with my father to illustrate yet another lesson we should have learned from that earlier era. How important it was and how wonderful for a child to grow up in a warm and loving relationship with his or her dad. I remember writing years ago about a teenager in Brooklyn named Kendra Newkirk, who was raised by her mom and had only seen her dad once in her life. Because of an emergency, I think there had been a fire in their apartment, Kendra and her mother had arranged to meet the father at a particularly busy public location in downtown Brooklyn. Kendra had no idea what her father looked like. It was hard, she told me. He could have been any one of those men walking on the street. I kept asking my mother, is that him? Is that him? The vast majority of births among African Americans today are to unwed mothers. And extraordinary numbers of black children are growing up with no fathers or father figures in their lives. The moms are sometimes heroic in their child-raising efforts, but all that I've personally experienced and everything that I've seen in my lifetime says that a youngster is much better off being raised by two loving parents, and that the role a father plays in the child's development is profound. My sister Sandy and I hit the jackpot when it came to parents. My mother and father were childhood sweethearts, and they married and stayed together until my mother died on her 67th birthday back in 1991. I lost my dad in 2002, and I think about both of them every day of my life. But it wasn't just my dad. I had father figures galore in my life, grandfathers on both sides of the family, a slew of uncles from our large extended family who offered love, guidance, and protection to a swarm of rambunctious cousins. So we had the best of all worlds, men and women, who were always there, who were always ready to embrace us, and who could always be depended upon. These folks I'm talking about, these grown-ups, these men and women, they took us to ball games and to the beach and to the movies and the zoo and even the botanical gardens in New York. When my Aunt Mary told me that we were going to the botanical gardens, I thought she'd lost her mind. What the heck is botanical? I hadn't a clue. I learned. We all gathered for feasts on holidays and for parties and weddings, and sadly, as the years passed, for funerals too. Now compare that life that I've just described to the lives of so many children, and not just black children, growing up today without fathers in their lives and without the benefits of a viable extended family. Compare that life to the lives of kids who get their support and validation from street gangs. Compare that life to the life of a young girl who approached me late one night in a parking lot in a dismal neighborhood in Atlanta. It was a cold night and the girl was shivering. She told me she was 15, but she couldn't have been more than 12. She was in the parking lot looking for Johns. I was doing a column for the New York Times about the gruesome exploitation of children in the sex trade. I explained to the girl who I was and asked if she wanted me to get someone to help her. She said she didn't need any help. She had a cheap gold chain around her neck that she fingered possessively and proudly told me that it had been given to her by her boyfriend. He loves me, she said. When I asked if her boyfriend knew what she was doing, she said he told me to do it. I asked again if she would wait right there on the spot with me while I called for someone who could provide her with a place to stay and services that could get her off the street. I remember her bangs fluttering in a cold breeze. She shrugged and said, I gotta go. I've covered so many horrible stories, and I've always wondered why there wasn't more anger about the atrocities that go on year after year after year. I especially don't understand the passivity that I see in the black community. I don't understand the black writers and thinkers who insist that we've entered some post-black or post-racial era in which racism has been so diminished as to be nearly insignificant. I don't understand a president who is unmistakably black but can hardly bring himself to utter the words black or African American in public. I don't understand the fathers who make babies one after another, beautiful children, gorgeous little boys and girls, and then refuse to take care of them, to be with them, or even in many, many cases, to acknowledge them. I don't understand the men and the boys with the guns who wantonly spray their bullets here, there, and everywhere. Is that the new black power? So, after this lengthy recitation of the troubles and hard times that have beset the black community, the question arises, who is going to do something about it? Well, we know from bitter experience that our elected officials and the public at large are not going to take the lead. The country is not much concerned with the hardships of black people. If you don't believe me, just look at the priorities of the two major political parties and the issues that the mainstream press chooses to spotlight. So it's up to black people themselves to provide the energy and the leadership on these matters while welcoming anyone of goodwill who would like to join in. The message I want to leave you with this evening is that the black community in America is in extremely serious trouble. I cannot overstate that. The community is facing a tragic crisis of enormous magnitude. It's in danger of being overwhelmed. And right now, no one is fighting hard enough to turn things around. It is time to throw off our shield of denial and begin to wage war against this madness. This is a battle that needs to be fought with passion and intelligence on two fronts. The continuing racism and outlandish inequities in this society constitute a plague that takes a horrendous toll day after day, year after year, and decade after decade. New leadership must be developed in the African American community to lead the forces necessary to eradicate that plague. Black Americans must be rallied anew to fight as never before for fairness and justice in a society that has always gone out of its way to deny blacks fairness and justice. There is no dignity and absolutely nothing to be gained by submitting passively to one's oppressors. The other front is the behavioral front. If the black family cannot be knit back together, all is lost. Black people are at or near the bottom of this society by almost every measure. That cannot be remedied if partying takes precedence over parenting, if the criminal acts and the drug abuse continue, if the flower of black manhood is wasted day after sorry day in the poisonous soil of America's prisons. Terrible injustices have been visited on black people in the United States, but there is never a good reason to collaborate in one's own destruction. I don't know how optimistic we have a right to be. We're talking about an awfully heavy lift here. A new embrace of education is essential, as is an insistence on finding work in a perpetually lousy job market. These are things that African Americans have to do if we're going to see any improvement in this awful situation. Big-time sacrifices have to be made. Money has to be saved. Down payments made on family homes. College educations paid for. Smart investments made to start building wealth. Leadership is needed to begin pulling the various talented strands of the Black community together for this fight. And much of that leadership will have to come from the younger members of the community. Even under the best scenario, success would take years and years. Do we have any reason to be optimistic? I hope so. Blacks in America have a long and proud history of overcoming hardship and injustice. It's time to do it again. Thank you very much. Sure. Thank you. I understand we're going to do some Q&A. I'll take questions on any topic, including the dismal state of the New York Jets. So.
There are microphones on both corridors. Please feel free to come and ask your questions.
Mr. Sandy, I didn't even recognize you at first.
Yeah, you made mention of the fact that we have a black president.
Yeah.
And
I know this fellow.
And do you see any possibility that he may improve things now that he's been elected to a second term and he doesn't have to worry about getting reelected?
That is my good friend Sandy Goodman. When I was at NBC as a television correspondent, went there as I was a columnist at the Daily News and knew nothing about doing TV. But they welcomed me at NBC anyway. It was a great time. But Sandy was the producer who would go out with me to do these stories where I was the correspondent. And thank God for Sandy. He was the one that kept my career going. He was the best of the producers at NBC at that time. So I'm always happy to hear from Sandy Goodman. And his wife, Jane, is there. So, you know, I think that you know, we've seen Obama for several years now, you know, and I think that by now we see who he is. So no, I don't anticipate much change. I think that he has established or has made a political calculation, and one that has worked remarkably well. I mean, he got to be president of the United States and then reelected for forget being black, for any Democrat to do that is a heck of an achievement in the past several decades. And when something is working for you as well as that's been working for him, I don't see why you would radically change it. So I don't anticipate much of a change from Barack Obama going forward. But I am disappointed. I don't think that Barack Obama is supposed to be a civil rights leader or the leader of black America. He's the president of the United States. I understand that. But when you have a significant portion of the population that's in as much trouble as the black community is in, I think that those difficulties need to be acknowledged by the highest officers in the land, not just the president, and some effort should be made to alleviate the suffering. Hi.
Hi. First of all, thank you for being here. I really appreciate getting the opportunity to hear you speak. I appreciate, too, and I think I understand why, in talking about how to address these problems, you frame much of it as things that black people need to do. We need a new civil rights movement. We need to think about behavior. I get that. You're also speaking to an almost entirely white audience.
I noticed.
I'm glad you're not the only one. My worry about the way you frame this is that it leaves us complacent. It leaves us with a sense that our job is to join that fight, perhaps, but not to take action and leadership on our own. And so I want to ask if there are things that you can say to us as we listen to the stories you tell that you think, I guess I'm asking you to think about this audience, and what would you say to us?
You know, I think this is an audience, and you personally, these are folks who are committed to social justice, who, you know, excuse me, I said in the talk that I've always been bothered by the lack of outrage at the terrible things that are going on, and not just in the African American community. But there is not just complacency in the larger population. Complacency would be an improvement. There's indifference, and then the indifference slides off into contempt. That's what I see in the wider community. The folks who would ask me to come here and speak on an issue like this are exceptions to the rule. This is not, trust me, this is not the norm. I mean, just watch CNN, watch the news. Look at we just went through a presidential campaign. So the thing that I would say to an audience like this is think not just about the black community, but what I see happening is that the conditions that we've seen for so long and paid so little attention to in the black community are bleeding over into the white community now. So that, you know, as I said in the speech, you're starting to see some of the same symptoms and some of the same behaviors and some of the same problems. And another point that I would really emphasize, it's usually the major point in these talks. This talk's a little different. The key to everything, I mean, I think that you need a new movement and you need people mobilized, but ultimately the key to everything is employment. We have to put people to work. Nobody is going to be able to make it without a decent job, and I'm not talking about all these lousy, low-wage contingent jobs that are out there now. We now have an economy in this society that is structured in such a way that it cannot provide enough work for all those who need work in this society. And just like we're not talking about the issues that are affecting the African American community specifically, we're not talking seriously about that issue either. So one of the messages that I would send out to this audience is the same message that I send most of the time when I'm speaking, that somehow, by hook or by crook, I'm not sure how you can do it, somehow the message has to be gotten across that we have to do something about employment in this country. You have to put people to work. Just a quick note, if you take college graduates, these are young people with 4-year degrees who have graduated since, say, 2006. Only about half of them, only a little more than half of them, have full-time jobs of any kind. And many of those have jobs that you no longer need, that you don't need a college education to hold. So what happens is the young people with only a high school education are getting pushed out of those jobs because the bosses can hire college graduates, and the kids who drop out of high school, I mean, they're just lost. I've done stories about them too, and they're just out of sight. They don't have work. I did stories on them in Chicago, and one of the things I said about them was out of school, out of work, and out of hope. So I would say to the wider community that it's important to emphasize relentlessly and nonstop the need to get our employment house in order, and that's an increasingly heavy lift. For blacks, it's what I said tonight. You have to try and break down the doors and bust into the wider community as best you can.
Good evening, Mr. Herbert. My name is Julie Shaining. I'm here, a PhD student at Georgetown. I had a question before I came to hear your talk, but actually a lot of points you made today relate to my question. I've been reading a book recently written by Robert Carroll on President Lyndon Johnson, the huge 4-volume series.
I love Bob Carroll.
Yeah, it inspired me greatly. And as a first-generation immigrant, I've only been in this country for 5 years. I find it astonishing that how the political situation back then in the 50s, 60s are so strikingly similar to what we have today. The two sides of the political ideology fight each other, but what Lyndon Johnson was fighting, his war on poverty, his dream to build the great society, the situation, the difficulties he was facing was actually very similar to the problems you're trying to address today. My question here, I don't want to get too political here. Do you think the history is actually going backward, or it's actually somewhat, cyclical, just like Wall Street, we're gonna have boom and bust? In my perspective, history should move forward. We should not have this movement of anti-modern and I don't
That's
know
what I used to think.
Yeah, so I'd like to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
Well, first, we are moving backwards. I mean, I think we're definitely moving backwards. I'd be careful about the similarities between Johnson's era and now. The political scene was really way different, even in the 50s when Eisenhower was president, than now. You didn't have the Yahoo Republicans with the kind of control that you had now. The Yahoos in those days, for the most part, actually were Southern Democrats who were nuts on race issues, but the politics were much more liberal in those days. Democrats were much more powerful. And then I think one thing that was incredibly important was that there was tremendous leadership on a broad front outside of the government with the labor unions, with the leaders of the civil rights movement and others. So, it was just easier to make progress in the ways that I think most of us think of progress being in those days than it is now. Now we have a Republican Party that is controlled by the right-wingers, that has a tremendous amount of clout, that have had very powerful presidents in recent history, and who, even when they're on the outside in terms of the way elections have gone, are absolutely willing to paralyze the government if they're not able to actually get their way. But are we going backwards? Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think we're going backwards. I don't know whether it's cyclical or not. I mean, we went through, we always go through economic cycles, and we went through the Depression, and, World War II was its own era. I can't say whether it's cyclical or not. I think of it much more that we were on a roll, that the country was very prosperous, and that people did get complacent with that prosperity. People who made money, made a lot of money, who once were pretty liberal or pretty progressive, became more conservative in their political outlook. And but then I think we also just took our eye off the ball, and there were a lot of self-inflicted wounds. We seemed, I think, because the United States was doing so well, especially in the 1960s, I think that there was a tendency to think that this would go on forever, and to forget how difficult it is and how much work it takes to keep a country the size of the United States on the right track, to think long term, to make the investments that would keep a society viable, that would make the next generation and the generation after that prepared by the time it came to take the handoff in leadership and that sort of thing. I think we fell down in all those areas and are paying a price for it now. And I think now a lot of people in this country, including a lot of our political leaders, just sort of look up in bewilderment and say, geez, there's so many problems and they're so enormous, you know, how do you ever get a handle on it? So, I mean, I hate to be so gloomy, but I think that we're in a bad fix here. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
You cited an issue for the Black community is the fact that many of the young Black men aren't taking responsibility for the children that they're bringing into the world. And so I guess how would a broken community rebuild itself?
That's a really good and a really important question. One of the first things that needs to be done is there needs to be an acknowledgement not just of what's going on, but the significance of what's going on. And I think that there has been an unwillingness in the Black community for a lot of reasons to acknowledge, or certainly acknowledge publicly, that this abandonment of their children by so many fathers has been so harmful to the community as a whole. There is tremendous resentment and hostility in the Black community over the racism in this. Hopelessness that this has gone on so long that, you know, there's not really much that you can do with it. I think even more important than that, though, is the denial I talked about. There was kind of a denial. Things are, in some cases, so horrendous you don't even want to acknowledge that they are as bad as they are. So one of the first steps you have to do is shake off that denial and acknowledge that this abandonment of children has such horrible consequences for the kids themselves and for the community as a whole. And then get together and talk about it and try and figure out how do you begin to knit this back together again. Now, it's unpopular in this day and age, and I never thought when I was a younger man that I would be the one who'd be talking about this sort of thing. But I think that it's important, even though we're in very tough economic times, to begin pushing the idea of getting married. I mean, I think that, you know, men and women, if you're going to have children, that it's much better all around if you can get married and raise those children together. And then the benefits from that just sort of flower. You know, even in middle-class America today, it mostly requires the income of 2 adults just to maintain a middle-class standard of living. The idea that you would be down at the bottom in terms of economics with poverty level or just a shade above poverty level income, and then you're supposed to make it on just 1 income, not 2, is just crazy. But I don't even think the income is the main reason for marriage. I think that we put the money, we cite the economic factor too often in this country. We talk about it when we talk about going to college, when we say, is college worth it? I think that you should get married if you want to, for the traditional benefits that marriage brings to the man and the woman who have formed this bond and this relationship, to the children that they bring into the world, and to the family that grows from that. I mean, when it works, it's just the most wonderful thing in the world. And I go around in these communities, And I see kids growing up who have no understanding of the kind of thing that I'm describing now, who don't know what they're missing out on. I've talked about this with my wife and several other people. If you were raised in a family where there was a mother and a father, and it was a good family dynamic, and you were raised there, try and think about what your life would have been like. Try to imagine if that father had never been in your life. I can't imagine what my life would have been like if my dad had had no part in it. I would have a tendency to think that I would have died if my dad hadn't been in my life. Well, the truth is that there are a lot of youngsters who have died because dads were not in their life. So I just think that it's important to have some leadership in the black community begin to try and get that message across. Start to make it cool to have loving relationships between men and women, and start promoting the idea that you don't get married just for the sake of getting married, but if you're hooked up with somebody and you fall in love and you care for that person, go ahead and get married and raise that family. Don't let the norm continue to be that you're not going to have the kind of families that I've been talking about. Yes, sir.
That's not a bad message for the white community either.
I completely agree with that, and this issue is becoming more of a problem in the white community than it traditionally had been.
I wonder if, as someone who spent a career in media, you could comment a bit. You mentioned a couple of times the things that the press covers and doesn't cover, and TV covers and doesn't cover. You spent your career in the media. There is a voice that could affect social change. How can you make that happen?
Me specifically?
No. You in the generic sense.
Because I'm going to be out of here. I have to write my play.
No, the media could play a role. Part of the cultural problems that we're having in the black and the white community has to do with what the kids are seeing.
Right, I agree.
What they're being exposed to. And the message that you gave tonight is not a message that is getting to kids, black or white.
Right.
And what do we do about the media?
I've had over the years a lot of thoughts about this. You know, if I could just wave a magic wand, I would have, if we're talking specifically about the black community, I would have more black people playing a more prominent role in mainstream media. And that could happen, but I think you have to make it happen. You have to raise some hell. You have to tell people, you know, what's going on. You know, the exclusion is not happening. But I would also have more black people establish their own media entities or media outlets, and then begin to cover some of these things in a serious way. That's easier to do now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. There's not a heck of a lot of money in it, but it's an important issue, and it is easier to do now. If I could wave the wand, I would have that happen. But I would also have African Americans begin to change the cultural landscape. I would have more stories out there that sort of promoted the idea of, I don't know, the upside of warm and loving relationships, dramatic, heartwarming stories about African American families and what they're going through and what the kids are like. You know, let's bring Disney into the 21st century, and maybe not quite as corny as the Mickey Mouse Club years, but but some good stories for the kids growing up. Hollywood did that for America way, way back in the 30s and the 40s and that sort of thing. What you want to do is change the cultural landscape so that you have a more positive and less destructive measure out there. And then as the youngsters are growing up, they begin to imitate what they see, and you want them to imitate these more positive images, these more positive people. You want them to fall in love with these more positive stories. I would change what's going, well, God knows I would change what's going on in music, but I think that there has been a deterioration in culture across the society. So I think that the great theater, the great music, the great novels that we had throughout that early post-war period, it's gone now. Television has deteriorated. You know, Kim Kardashian, I mean, I hate to keep picking on her, but give me a break. Snooki is a cultural hero in this country. I mean, it's just absolutely insane. So if I could wave the wand, I'd begin to change all of that. I actually think that it can change. I think that you get reactions to cultural phenomena that in the long run just are not working. And at some point, the young people wake up and they say, enough already. One final point on the cultural thing. To me, I think there's such a rich African-American culture in this country historically. But when you think about gospel music and the creation of blues and jazz and rhythm and blues and the beginnings of rock and roll, and you think about people like Duke Ellington and Count Basie and Billie Holiday and Louis Armstrong and just on and on and on. And what do we have now? Rap? I mean, kindergarten rhymes? This is not art. We had some of the greatest artists the country has ever known, you know? And then you come to kindergarten rhymes. So, you know, I'm not happy with what's going on. I never thought that I was going to become the old fogey talking about, oh, it was so much better when I was young. You know, but that seems to have happened.
There was one point that I was kind of waiting for you to mention, and maybe it just hasn't been your experience. We found that the tremendous increase in the cost of a college education has disproportionately hurt the poor and the black, both in two ways. Bobby and I remember sitting in a high school counselor's office in the Bronx in April, and he's saying to us this was his worst time of year because the kids would be coming in, having been accepted to a college, and getting a partial scholarship, and is telling them, well, you can't go there. You do not have the money to make up the difference. That I think the increased cost in higher education has tremendously hurt the black community, both by their not being able to afford it and also by driving more of, say, the middle class into the state and city schools that previously had been accepting many more blacks. I just wondered if you had experienced this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced it exactly as the way you have just described it. I mean, the costs of college have gotten so high now that it is out of the reach of so many middle-class families in this country. So if you're talking about lower income groups, it has a devastating effect, and it has had a devastating effect on African-American kids and African-American families. I don't have the data right here, but I have seen it. We've already seen lower college-going rates. You make the point about the elite schools, absolutely harder and harder to get into the elite schools, not just the Ivy League. More and more kids going to community colleges because that's what they can afford. More and more kids. This is a story that needs to be done. More and more kids beginning college and finding out after a couple of years or so that they can't afford it, but then they've got these college loans that they've still got to pay off, and they don't have a degree. It's really a terrible situation. I'm here talking about what I think of as the joys and the importance of marriage and raising a family and that sort of thing, but I don't want to give the impression that I think that it's easy. It's not easy in this employment environment and in an environment in which it's so difficult for people without a lot of money to get a college education. I am just saying that even though it's not easy, the benefits are so vast, and culturally, over a long period of time, the family is so important that you almost have to do everything to make it happen, no matter how difficult it is. So, any other questions? We may have wrapped it up. Thank you very much. This has been like really an enjoyable evening for me. I appreciate it. Thank you.
There's really not very much more to say after tonight's lecture. The Q&A was excellent. You've all been obviously rapt. I've never heard an audience so quiet and so intent on listening to what a man like Bob Herbert has said. We have a lot to think about and a lot to try to do. This is an example of the kinds of programming that Bobby and Herb have brought through the Ellen Gstalder Memorial Lecture, and the sorts of things that we try to do to provoke your thought, to raise your intellect, and to stimulate you to think about ways that we can all participate in making things better. Join me once again in thanking Bob Herbert for his extraordinary presence. Thank you once again to the Library Associates, to the Gstalder family for making this lecture possible. Join us, if you're not a member of the Library Associates, join us in the campaign for Georgetown for generations to come. Thank you all, and good night.